an amendment on clean water, so I had to be voting. But thank you all for participating in this. This is very important. I'm going to be able to go back and tell my colleagues this is what they ought to be doing all over the country. Is all about, and frankly, the way we determine policies is not through rhetoric, it's through the budget. What are our values? Our values are primarily determined by what we're willing to spend money on, how much revenue we raise, how we raise that revenue. Those are all things that are intrinsic to what this country is all about. And that's why it's so important for all of you to be here tonight. I'm really struck by the interest. Of course, I know that this is not a random sample of all congressional districts. Statistically, you're better educated, you have more upward mobility, et cetera, but nevertheless, if we had not had this kind of a turnout, I'd have been disappointed. There's no greater issue than before us right now, as far as I'm concerned, in resolving this budgetary issue, because it is related to jobs, quality of life, et cetera, as well as the welfare of subsequent generations. I want to thank Jeff Thiebert with the Concord Coalition. I know that there are deficiencies in this sheet, and this constituency would catch those issues that are not out there. In fact, no sooner had I walked in the room that people asked about Medicare negotiating under Part D. Well, that's a important issue. It's not going to be asked in most congressional districts. I appreciate the fact that it is here. People want to know why they don't have an option to say eliminate the war and generate money that way and so forth. But for all its perhaps deficiency, the fact is this is the best form that any group has come up with yet. So I want to thank the Concord Coalition. They have earned a reputation for budgetary integrity. And it's independent. I will, because some of you may leave before we have an opportunity to speak again, let me just share a few thoughts with you, if you don't mind. I'll give you a little break from the intensity of the discussions. In 2001, we had a projected surplus for this year, 2011, of $2.3 trillion based upon the tax rates that were in place then. Since then, we've had a $12.7 trillion budgetary reversal because we now have a $10.4 trillion deficit instead of that $2.3 trillion surplus. And that's the problem with the budgetary negotiations. It's why almost 40% of what we spend is borrowed. But what happened, and I voted consistent with what I'm complaining about, neither of the two tax cuts were paid for. If people want to argue that they generated new economic activity, the most generous estimate is 13% were paid for through new economic activity as a result of tax cuts. Both wars were never paid for. There were only half a dozen of us that actually voted to have a surcharge to pay for the cost of the war. In other words, if you think the war is a good idea, you ought to be willing to pay for it rather than pass that cost on to our children and grandchildren. About 400 people voted not to pay for it. And then, of course, the Medicare Part D. What is most troubling about that is that the government is not allowed to negotiate with the drug companies. So we're paying virtually retail price. In some cases, we pay 3 times as much as the Veterans Administration pays for drugs under Part B because they can negotiate. They can use the power of the number of people they're representing to get much lower prices. So those things alone, if we restored those, the 2 tax cuts and every member of what's now every member of what is now the majority in the House of Representatives, well, a lot of new members are there, every Republican voted to let the tax cuts expire in 2011 because we knew we couldn't possibly afford them in the out years. So all Republicans and most of the, well, every Democrat that voted for them voted to let them expire. So if you let both tax cuts expire, go back to the tax rates of the 1990s, and I have to say that people at the top rate had more after-tax income than at any time, prior time in American history. 21 million new jobs created, reduced poverty, had welfare reform, etc. Obviously, I have strong feelings about this and was involved in it. But if you let those expire, if you eliminate the wars, which have never been paid for, have been paid for by supplementals on top of the $650 billion regular defense budget, and if you saved however many tens of billions from negotiating for lower drug prices, you would be in primary balance. You would bring in as much revenue as is going out. Right now, we are bringing in about 15% of GDP. We're spending about 25% of GDP. Normally, if you compromised, which is what they're supposed to be doing now, you know, politics is supposed to be the art of compromise, you'd cut spending by 5%, maybe not immediately, but certainly over the decade. You'd cut spending by 5%, you'd increase revenue by 5%, you'd get to the 20%, which is the historic level of revenue that the federal government normally takes in. The problem with staying at a 15% level of revenue, in my estimation, is what it's doing to the public sector. In May, about 48,000 public sector jobs were lost. This month, 39,000 public sector jobs were lost. There was a gain of 18,000. In other words, the private sector gained 57,000 jobs this month, but the reason it was so anemic was the public sector losses. About 500,000 public sector jobs have been lost just in the last year. It's projected if the current budget, what was referred to by the Republicans as the Ryan Republican budget, if that is passed with the reduced spending, the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan estimation of the cost is that about a little over 1 million public sector jobs will be lost because a lot of them are matched by federal money. So if you continue to lose, 12, roughly it would be 100,000 jobs per month. If you continue to lose anywhere near that number of public sector jobs, unemployment is never going to go up. The public sector, one of the ideological things we argue about is public versus private. The private generates more lasting income, public sector is leeching from the taxpayer, etc. But public sector employees have mortgages to pay, they have automobile payments, they shop in restaurants and stores, etc. That money is particularly important to Northern Virginia. So, where I'm coming from, my perspective is, first of all, what's best for Northern Virginia? And of course, we've been a microcosm of the high growth areas of the country. Public transportation, for example. We cut public transportation by $15 billion per year for each of the next 6 years in the authorization that's going to be on the floor next week. If we cut it by $15 billion a year, we're not going to expand public transit, which means we can't grow. We don't have, in a metropolitan growth area, you don't have the room for more asphalt. You've got to build public transit, but as you make that investment, not only do you create jobs, you create a stronger economic foundation for the future. That's the argument that we're making. And personally, what I would do is to do just what I suggested, go back to what was working. If you don't do that, the other alternative is Bowles-Simpson. Eliminate your expenditures, taxes, which are deductions and credits. Those amount on an annual basis to over $1 trillion. Just eliminate them. In fact, 70% of the American taxpayers don't don't deduct. They don't use the law form. So you could do that. Many suggest that's more equitable. One of the problems we have is an equity issue. We now have about 40% of our nation's wealth concentrated in the hands of 1% of our nation's wealthiest. and 90%, the bottom 90%, I hate to say bottom, but the bottom 90% control 26% of the nation's wealth. That's the greatest economic disparity we've had since the Great Depression. One last point that I want to emphasize, because if we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat it. In 1937, we were just getting out of the Great Depression. And President Roosevelt, to deal with the Congress, agreed to cut back spending, to try to balance the budget. And we cut back in a lot of the public employment programs, the infrastructure programs that they had invested in during the 30s to take us out of the Depression. It kept us in the Depression. And if you look at the economic statistics, what pulled us out of depression was spending. It was spending on World War II. It started in 1941, supplying military equipment to Europe. And then, of course, we go into the war, we bring women into the workforce, and that kind of momentum carried us through the 50s and really through the 60s as well. I fear that if our reaction to this recession is to cut revenue further, cut public spending, let the private sector sit on the sidelines with more than $2 trillion of money they've accumulated because they can borrow money virtually free, then we could well go into an even deeper double-dip recession. That's my greatest concern. Now, there are any number of other issues you're going to be dealing with. One we dealt with last week, which is an example of why I stay in the Congress, because I get emotionally involved. Last week, we cut what's called the WIC program. It's nutritious meals for women and children. It's for very low-income women and low birth weight babies. 300,000 lost nutritious meals in order to save $600 million. The problem is that $600 million is exactly equal to the tax cuts that millionaires enjoy for 1 week. So, in other words, it's 1/52nd of the amount of tax cuts that go to millionaires. In a country like ours, this becomes an ideological issue, an issue of values. 57% of a child's brain is formed in the first trimester. If they don't get adequate nutrition, they're not competitive economically or intellectually. So do you make that kind of investment in the earliest years, or do you take government out of it? These are generally women who don't pay taxes. So you make the argument, well, it's not their money, it's the millionaire's money. But if you don't make that investment, we know that a large portion of those children, because they're not competitive in school, they wind up getting incarcerated. It costs $40,000 to $70,000 per year for someone to stay behind bars vegetating. We have the largest percentage of population of any country, including Russia and Iran, behind bars in the United States. So where's your values? What are your priorities? There are thousands of issues like this that we debate every day. I would love to see all of you involved in as many of those issues as possible. They're your issues. They are defining of who we are as a nation, in what direction we go forward, and what kind of a life our children and grandchildren are going to inherit. We got the Interior Bill coming up tomorrow morning. I'm the ranking member. It's going to take hours. We're going to sell mining rights to the Japanese to mine uranium in Yellowstone Park and so on. All of these issues we'll fight over. 99.5% of the American public are never going to know about them. But you should. And I hope you will, because there's nothing better than representing a community like I do in Northern Virginia. And this is a reflection of why it's so wonderful to represent you. Whatever side of the political spectrum you fall on, the fact that you're interested enough to come and participate with your neighbors, come up with recommendations, share that with me so that I'm better informed as to how I can best represent you, but also gain a better informed perspective of the issues we're dealing with. I thank you all for being here.